to season 1, episode 8 of Next Question Now. For those of you who are just joining us, this is a live magazine style discussion, which we host almost weekly, where we always, though, host passionate and thoughtful speakers, bringing people together to talk about today's timely, sometimes tough, and always interesting issues. My name is Leah Roundtree, and I'm very, very grateful to have the opportunity to facilitate this conversation and others, not only between the guests that we have on the show, but also with you, our community members and attendees. Before we get started, though, I want to recognize the amazing team at Peterson Capital who are supporting and presenting this series. They are very driven to help investors understand what's going on in the world, to help make better decisions so that the entrepreneurs can fuel Canada's economic future. But I'm really excited to be working with them because they are very, very passionate about bringing people together to talk about diverse ideas and to bring some new concepts to the conversation. So thank you very much to Peterson Capital. And thank you to everybody who's watching live. For those of you who are watching live, please do jump in on the Q&A and let us know if you have any questions for our speaker. And for those who are watching live, please do know that all of these recordings go live on our YouTube channel and soon to be podcast channel. So I hope you will join our communities there. We also have robust communities developing on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. I would like to say now a very, very huge thank you to James Hoggan. I'm going to call him Jim if I can. He is quite well known, particularly here in BC, because he has had a very robust career in the communications field. But what I am particularly fascinated with is a turn that he has had in the last number of years to really look at, as he calls it, today's warlike approach to public discourse. And I was very drawn to his ideas when a friend of mine gave me his book. It's called I'm Right and You're an Idiot: The Toxic State of Public Discourse and How to Clean It Up. And if I was to look at the one thing that I am the most passionate about doing and what I hope to accomplish in my short time on earth, it is to help bring more civil discourse to today's most controversial topics. So I can't imagine a better speaker. I can't imagine a more timely conversation. We are recording this live on Wednesday, October 20th, 2021, where I would say probably the most heated topic that we are living with right now is to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. Excited about getting into the conversation, but first let me say thank you very much, Jim, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And before we get started, you are recording this live from Salt Spring Island, is that correct?
I am in our beautiful property overlooking the ocean on Salt Spring.
Well, and I'm recording this live from the Chilcotin in Interior BC, and Quinn, our amazing technology guy, is helping support this from Spain. So I'm excited that technology at least is showing us an improvement in how we can have conversations. But let's talk about the human element of it first. So for those who haven't read your book, let's just back up. And first of all, just tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this topic.
Yeah, well, I guess it was inevitable that the business I was in, I owned a big public relations company, and at maybe probably 10 years before I started writing this book, we were the biggest PR agency in Western Canada, and we found ourselves in the middle of a lot of controversy, and not about us normally, but it was about our clients. Mm-hmm. So whether we were representing the forest industry or the mining industry or the David Suzuki Foundation or the University of British Columbia or a hospital, we basically represented many of the big institutions in this part of Canada. One of the things that I found was that more and more we were hearing people shouting. And people were listening more to the yelling back and forth than they were to what the evidence was saying. And there seemed to be, over time, more and more of a gap between what we should be talking about and what we were talking about. And there seemed to be so much more kind of ad hominem treatment of issues when we disagreed with people. We were calling people names rather than trying to make a case for what we believed. And this was well before Donald Trump or before COVID, or, it might have been in the early days of climate change, but it was, it didn't seem to matter what the issue was. There was just this kind of pollution in the public square. I mean, one of the ways I think about it is the pollution. I think of it as a kind of an unyielding one-sidedness, like people just forgetting that they could be wrong. And there's no such thing as being right if you can't be wrong. And if you're always right and everybody else is always wrong, and that basically is the end of public thinking. It's the end of public discourse. And if we can't talk things out, then we can't get things done. If there's no kind of approximate version of the truth that we can all get close to, it's very difficult to make good public policy decisions. And my business was in the public policy world a lot. And we represented government in Victoria, some in Vancouver and Ottawa. And what happens when you can't disagree constructively is you end up making bad decisions in government. And bad decisions in government can be expensive. They can be tough on everything from healthcare to education to environment to the quality of life for people, affordability in housing. And so more and more, it seemed to me that as people became more and more involved in social media, it just seemed to be getting worse and worse. And as time has gone on, it's actually gotten far worse than anything I could have ever imagined. And I know it's something that we're all familiar with.
Well, I'm curious, just to jump in there about the social media in particular. So I am getting older, but not old enough to remember what it was like to live through, for example, the Civil War in the United States or the Civil Rights Movement, in the middle of the last century, or even the conversation around prohibition or the conversation around whether or not we should join, we as in, North America, the Second World War, Vietnam War. We've had and I can't even imagine what people were feeling controversy over before that. But, presumably this is a lifelong human condition that we have things that we disagree on. So those were pretty challenging times. Is it more challenging because of social media, or is it just that social media makes it faster? What is exactly the role of social media in making it at least feel that it's never been as bad as it is now?
Yeah, no, I think probably part of what you just said about the speed of it is clearly central. So for me, I think that there's two things going on today that make it quite a bit different and a lot worse. One of them is the evolution of social science. So my business, the public relations business, basically started in somewhere around 1930. Back in those days, there was no such thing as public polling. There was no such, we haven't even discovered focus groups. So social scientists hadn't developed tools that would look at the way people's thinking would evolve with certain kinds of information. But over the decades, more and more work was done by social sciences on how to influence people's thinking. And part of that is that, and one of the kind of key elements of the public relations business, that if you want to call it a discovery or the realization, and the public relations business, by the way, basically was developed by people who were in the propaganda business in the war.
Right.
And so when the First World War was over, so many of these people, as Western cultures started to become heavily industrialized, developed these techniques so you could get people to buy stuff and believe stuff and do things that you wanted them to do. And we got better and better at it because the social science became more and more accurate in its predictions. Then along comes Facebook or social media. And the way the algorithms work in social media is they search for attention. Like the algorithms, weirdly, just to take a step back, this was all started with very good intentions. I don't know if you remember back in the early days when Facebook and Twitter were starting, one of the things that these kind of progressive people in Silicon Valley wanted to make sure of was that the social media was accessible. And so they didn't want to sell it to people. They wanted it to be free.
Right.
But in order to actually pay for it, you had to sell advertising on it. And to sell advertising on it, you had to convince advertisers that you were effective. And so these algorithms got really good at figuring out what buys and what keeps eyeballs. And one of the things that they discovered is we pay more attention to negative things. Negative emotions are quicker, they are more engaging. And so social media basically feeds us conflict because that's kind of what we look for. That's what gets our attention, is the sort of outrage and the anger and the fear and so social media is a much worse version of mainstream media, which has never really been about how everything's okay. Mainstream media basically has been about conflict ever since I can remember. It's about planes crashing, not about planes landing safely. Right. And in fact, I was in the business of trying to convince the media that on behalf of my clients that things are nowhere near as bad as they were saying they were.
Isn't that interesting?
I mean, that's kind of what we did. Well, social media has taken that to a much greater extent. And these tools that we have make it much more accurate. And so we basically have created higher levels of conflict, and that creates, once you bring tribalism into public conversations at the level that we're bringing it in right now, it shuts down public thinking. And that's where we are, I believe.
Well, and just one final note on the social media side of it. What is the role of anonymity? Because it strikes me that, people will say things on social media that they might not have the courage to. I don't know if it's a courage issue, that you wouldn't have if you're sitting aside from somebody, you see them as a human, you see the humanity in them, you see maybe there's something triggered on a biological level, perhaps some compassion or some empathy. I mean, obviously there's been people can be very hostile in person as well, but is anonymity a factor in escalating this?
It is. I think it is. And not just anonymity, bots. You may not even be having an argument with a person. You might actually be talking to a Russian bot,
Right.
So you don't even know who you're having whether or not the person you're having an argument with is actually a human.
Right.
And so people, I think advisors, people in the public relations business, particularly people in the political realm, in the public relations business, have learned over the last number of decades that if you want to motivate people, create enemies.
Right.
And the weird thing about that it works, right?
Right.
People tend not to vote for who they like. They vote against who they don't like. And if you can turn these people on the other side into, animals or vermin or hateful people, then what happens is you can motivate your base to get out and vote. And so these emotions that these algorithms look for are fear, hate, outrage, anger, and I think it's basically the financial model of Facebook and other social media that are the most problematic. If social media, if Facebook was like the public library, you wouldn't have this problem.
Right. Well, it's interesting because that actually is how I understand it to be, that people were trained for war, particularly when it was hand to hand, or more one of your old school methods of war, is that you had to dehumanize the person on the other side so that you could harm them in the context of fulfilling what it was you were going to war for. And as I understand it, that was very effective. And there were big propaganda campaigns. Again, you didn't speak of the soldiers on the other side as humans. You used words and derogatory terms and very much dehumanized people, and it was effective.
Yeah. I mean, I had this interesting interview. I interviewed the Dalai Lama for my book in Dharamsala. And right at the very end of the interview, they turned off the cameras and we stood up, and he sort of reached over and almost put his finger on my forehead. And he said, "We like to think the Western mind is more sophisticated, but in Tibet, we go with the heart." And so maybe if we take the Western mind and the Tibetan heart, and we bring them together, that we can be more successful in these relationships. And he said that that the real problem for human beings these days are these negative emotions that we have. Mm-hmm. And what we need is more warm-heartedness. And you sort of think about that and you think, I've thought about it ever since I had that conversation with him. And one of the things that I realized is that it's almost like he's giving advice for how you actually open up a conversation and learn something, so that you're not misunderstanding what it is that somebody who disagrees with you is actually saying.
Well, that's a huge part of it, is to start and to not even exactly know what it is that you're arguing about, or to create, I guess that's called the straw man principle, where you create an argument that actually isn't even on the table. I'm really, really interested in this concept of combining heart and mind, because there's a few things, and I'm sorry, I'm so excited about this conversation. I've had so many things on my mind about it. But there's a few things here. So one of them is that we will take an issue. So let's talk about vaccines for the moment, because it's the one that's top of mind right now. So somebody that is, believes in the importance of taking a vaccine will look at somebody who's not wanting to take a vaccine, and you say, well, they're being irrational, right? So we talk about it on an intellectual level. But there's an interesting concept that says, well, but given the facts that this person has, or the information and the context in which they received the information, and the filter, the glasses that they put on, which is all of their values and experiences and past experiences and whatnot, in the context of that person as a human being in the moment right now, they're actually making what is a rational decision for them. And so the challenge is, and I say this, even though, and I literally just before we started this conversation was having a conversation about vaccines and the frustration of from my perspective, trying to encourage people to get vaccines. But so we say, well, I'm being rational and you're not being rational. And so when I remember to do this, I say, in the context of the information that this person has been fed by the algorithms that they're looking for, and their family of origin and the culture that they grew up in, and potentially their religion, they're actually acting in a very rational way. And so that allows me to sort of say, okay, well, there's some empathy or some understanding that ironically we are starting from a similar playing field. Does that make sense, the way I've described it?
Yeah, and this was part of the conversation I had with a lot of these social scientists. And one of them was a guy who teaches dispute resolution and conflict resolution in Nashville. And he came up with this idea, and it was something. What he said to me was, "Beware of the advocacy trap." And I said, "Well, what's the advocacy trap? Well, what are you talking about?" And he said, sorry, I'd forgotten what the university was. He teaches at Vanderbilt University, and anyway, he said the advocacy trap is this. He said, it's possible for someone to be dead wrong about something, but still be a good person. But if you don't see that, then you're in danger of falling into the advocacy trap, which is this sort of sense of things that when someone, so you take a position on something that you feel strongly about, and someone disagrees with you. And at first you just think they're wrong, so you try to explain it to them, but they persist. And so eventually, if they continue to persist and you feel strongly about what you're saying, you start to wonder what they're up to, and you become,
what secret agenda do they have, and who's paying them to say this? And
that's right. And you start to look at them not so much as just wrong, but as someone who hasn't maybe got good intentions, and maybe is even actually a wrongdoer. And before you know it, it's a battle between good and evil, and David and Goliath, and you're using a part of your brain, that fight or flight part of your brain, that actually disassociates your brain from the frontal cortex, where you actually think rationally. So there's actually cognitive scientists who've studied the way, where your brain is firing in different parts of these types of disputes that we have between humans. And when you're in that fight or flight part of your brain, open-minded thinking shuts down. And it's really about
there's a biological response. So we're not even in control then at that point.
That's right. And so people who just being right is not enough.
Right.
And so when you're in that, you could be in that fight or flight, feeling threatened part of your brain, just like somebody who's dead wrong could be. So you have the dead right person, the dead wrong person having this fight, and they're both in the wrong part of their brain. So to me, one of the things that I realized when I was writing my book is that you have to pay attention to whether or not whether there's actually the space to have the conversation. So when you are in this advocacy trap and you think that the other person is evil, people don't you don't treat evil people well.
No, not at all.
And so you have to kind of reopen this space where you can have the conversation. It doesn't require that you have to admit that something that is clearly wrong isn't.
No.
So the other person can still be wrong, but your job is to make sure that they feel that there's some respect coming from you, that there's an opportunity to go into some common ground and open up the conversation. And this is not easy, but these days, that if I was raising some young kids, I'm not now, I'm older, but if I was doing that, I would make sure that they were learning this stuff, because our ability to deal with conflict and disputes is going to be totally tied to our success in the business world, in politics, in academia. This ability to be able to, what Thich Nhat Hanh, this Tibetan or this Buddhist priest, told David Suzuki and I, it was something like this. He said, you don't need to tell people they're destroying the planet. They know they're destroying the planet. You need to deal with the despair. And I said, you're not saying that David Suzuki shouldn't be an activist, are you? And he said, speak the truth, but not to punish. Speak the truth, but not to punish. And it's such a powerful piece of advice to learn these ways of behaving, even if it's something you feel strongly about and the other person is ill-informed or wrong. I really think that being able to deal with conflict, to deal with these disputes and get really good at it, that's where the future of democracy lies.
Well, so there's so many things here that I want to unpack. So let's back up just 2 thoughts ago. And so you had said that there's sort of a layer of emotion, and it's really interesting. So it's always interesting to talk about like theoretical things, but I'll bring it down to something. So I'm really passionate about animal rights, and I try to follow a vegan lifestyle. I know you're very passionate about the environment. And I know that when I was a new vegan, I came at the world, it was completely obvious to anybody looking at me. I was full of like shaming and judgment, and I've seen the light, and I have these ideas, and if only you just listen. And of course, I think about it myself. Shame and judgment has never encouraged me to change my mind about anything. So once I settled out a little bit, I still feel as passionately. I probably feel more passionate about it now, but my approach, I hope, is much different, trying to meet people where they are and not come at it with a shame and judgment. But that's easier said than done, because inside I'm feeling this, as I'm sure you feel being involved in, for example, climate change. We all have the issues that we're passionate about. It's like there's this sense of urgency and panic. Like, I don't have time to sit here and be patient, and sort of walk you through this. I'm sure that's what public health officials are feeling with the vaccine. So it requires a certain level of discipline, and also that there's this thought that can sneak in. Is the other, you mentioned sort of the good and evil, but does the other person have the good intentions in the conversation that I do? And sometimes I know for myself, I come in and out of, am I really staying and sitting in that good intention place? And then if you start to doubt that the other person also has good intentions, it can unravel very quickly.
Absolutely. And I don't know how far anger is from compassion, it's not like they're polar opposites. What you're talking about is very compassionate. But
I find myself feeling anger to the person who's about to eat a steak, even though in my head it's like, be compassionate. And then I'm like, but if I'm not being compassionate in that moment, how can I be talking about compassion?
Yeah, one of the things Jane Fonda is a friend of Suzuki's, and David had a 85th birthday not too long ago, and Jane Fonda was up in Vancouver, and I was at the dinner. And she's really got taken the hits over the years for some of the things she's done publicly. But one of the things she said that I really admire is that she's learned over her life is that it's not about the person. It's about the ideas. So go after the ideas. Don't go after the person. And I would say the main reason not to do that, not go after the person, is it just doesn't work.
Well, that's the thing. It's just not effective. And if you really care about your cause, you don't want to do anything that's going to help make it go backwards.
That's right. And so one of the women that I interviewed, her name was Carol Tavris. And she wrote a best-selling book called Mistakes Were Made, But Not by Me. and this book, she's very cool, this woman. And she was, at the time, she was the editor of Psychology Today. She's a PhD in some kind of psychotherapy or something. And I interviewed her in this beautiful home in the foothills of Los Angeles and Hollywood. And she said that whenever you make a decision to do something, like doesn't matter what, you will quickly get into this process of looking for things to confirm the decision that you made is correct.
Well, we all want that, don't we?
Absolutely.
We want some comfort, and we hang on to certainty like it's going to save us. Yeah,
that's right. And what ends up happening, though, is that as you collect these reasons you're right and ignore these things that may raise questions about whether or not you are, you become more convinced at how right you are. And she said that there's this, one of the most heavily studied areas of social psychology is this area called cognitive dissonance, which is this sort of state of mind where something comes along that contradicts your feeling that you are a smart, fair-minded, good person.
Right.
And so something you do or something, and all of a sudden you're confronted with this feeling, and we'll do anything to avoid
not feel that.
not feel that, right? And that can happen to both somebody who's on the wrong side of an issue and somebody's on the right side of an issue. So it's very difficult for people to admit they're wrong.
Right.
And so in the business of communications, part of your job is to help people feel more comfortable with that. And so by shaming them, you're doing the opposite of that, right? And I remember, when I was back in the early days of doing climate change communication stuff, sitting down at dinner with a bunch of people and sitting at the head of the table, and my wife looking at me and said, "Good for you. You've made it 20 minutes into dinner without saying anything about climate change." Right? And you sort of think like, "Oh yeah,
She
okay."
kicking you under the table or something at the time? It's like my husband with like, don't comment on what the person just ordered for dinner. Just eat your chickpeas.
Yeah. So, but the thing is that the solution isn't in giving up on our values and what's right. I mean,
No.
Thank God that you feel the way you do.
Right.
And so the trick is how do you do that and respect the other person? And that is like super hard. And, or maybe it's not super hard when it's simple, but it can get really hard. And so I think that it demands of us an ability to learn how to open up these spaces where you can have heart-to-heart conversations, which I think that's kind of what warm-heartedness is. That's what the Dalai Lama is talking about.
Right. Right. Well, it's interesting. And there's a few things that I love this conversation because it's really contributing, at least to my personal framework as to how to have conversations. And I know that the people that are watching this are here because they want to do the same thing. And there's a couple of things that I think assist in that framework. One actually comes from Jordan Peterson, the psychologist at a previously University of Toronto, but he said, approach every conversation as if there is something to learn, because often we forget about the purposes of a conversation. And I think that your phrase, it was the advocacy. We approach conversations as if we're advocating for something.
Advocacy trap.
The advocacy trap. And so I think that's kind of a similar concept. So he says, you can be sitting next to somebody, you think, oh my God, I've got nothing to learn from this person. And if you approach the conversation that way, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You will not learn anything from that person. So he says, you're already in the conversation. You're already sitting there. You're at the dinner. You're stuck on the bus, whatever it is that you're doing, or it's a conversation that you've chosen to get into. So look for what you can learn. And the other thing, that there's a woman named Byron Katie, and she's quite an advocate for inquiring into whether or not our thoughts are true. And she's very much, and you maintain your stand. She says anger is sort of one of those emotions that if used appropriately, it's a clarifying emotion. So it theoretically, this is what a neuroscientist told me recently, is that anger appropriately will only last for 90 seconds. And if you use it for the tool that it is, it's to help you get clarity. But if you extend anger longer than 90 seconds, that just means that you're stuck in your own story and you're going to start to get into an unhelpful state of mind with it. And I guess the last piece of it is that there is something to be said for reframing or recreating the person that you're having a conversation with. So for example, I spent half of my career in Calgary when I was running my last event series. And so we have a lot of good friends in Calgary, a lot of good friends in the oil services industries and those that support them. And I can quite honestly say there's very few people that I met that I thought, weren't good people and weren't great people. And so if you talk to somebody in the oil services industry, they say, but I'm trying to provide jobs and I'm trying to provide tax dollars, for healthcare. And I'm trying to, there is a real passion there. And so to say, if you disagree with the industry, it's not that the people there necessarily have bad intentions. It's just that their focus is on jobs and the economy and the benefits that we all get from that. And to acknowledge that that is what somebody is up to can go a long way to go, yes, and now what other conversation could we get into? But to acknowledge the spirit in which people are, I think, genuinely trying to make a contribution And whether it's talking about oil services or veganism or vaccines or whatnot, it strikes me that I don't know what the percentage is, but it's like very few of our percentage of our population are actually psychotic.
Right.
So most humans are actually here trying to do the right thing, right? Like we have good intentions, we have good hearts.
Yeah, I mean, when I was starting out in business, and I was starting to kind of feel like a hot shot in the PR business, I had a mentor, and we used to call him Grandpa Mike, and he built a big chain of public relations companies and sold them and made lots of money, and he was mentoring young people, and he was a Quaker.
Okay.
And a very interesting guy. And one time he told me that I needed to turn every meeting into a tell me more meeting.
Oh.
And so it didn't matter whether or not it was, an employee who was upset about something, or it was a new business person or opportunity. It was just tell me more, tell me more. And it's so funny because I was just reading this fantastic book that I would highly recommend to everybody by a woman named Amanda Ripley called High Conflict.
Okay.
And she, at the end of this, she talks about essentially what we've been talking about here. And she's a journalist who went around and spent a lot of time with these conflict resolution people. And in her book, she writes about the difference between high conflict, which is conflict where people are just fighting and not listening and nothing's getting done. The disagreement just gets worse, and just healthy conflict, where like we do have differences of opinion. It is good. We live in an adversarial society. There's a reason that we disagree. It's a reason we have two parties in government or more. And
is there a biological or an evolutionary nature to, I mean, I kind of think we must have this for a reason. At some point, it must have been good.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There probably is something like, but I know when I went to law school, I learned about the adversarial system in a court, where you got the prosecution, you got the defense, you've got the judge and the jury, and everybody's got a different job. And the idea behind having these debates and these disputes and everything is that it'll help you get to the truth. But when you're doing it in such a way that it actually does the opposite, then then things have broken down, which is, I think, the problem that we're having. So this whole idea of tell me more, it seems to me, is a way of it's a way of creating a kind of a respectful conversation, of beginning a conversation where you might end up disagreeing with someone, but at least the other person knows that you respect them enough to actually listen to what they say. And so I have this thing that I try to practice because I tend to be quite reactionary. And so I do this tell me more thing, which it changed my business when Mike Sullivan taught me how to do that. It really changed my business in a very good way. And I started to develop this reputation for being a good listener, which my wife thought was the most hilarious thing she'd ever heard. But it actually worked. And I think in these high conflict situations, we need to get better at that. And we need to get better at ensuring the other people feels listened to, respected, and heard, at the same time that we don't give up on our values.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Well, so let's talk about, I just hate the fact that we don't, I could talk about this. This is going to require some sequels here, but so let's talk about values, and then let's talk about the wholeheartedness and some more solutions. So onto the values, that seems to be a sticking point, because you can say, well, I don't know, maybe somebody agrees that, say, vaccines are good for individuals and good for us as a society, but maybe they say, okay, but my values say that we shouldn't mandate them. So is there just sometimes where values mean that you cannot get to a consensus or an agreement? Like, or is there a way around values? What is the role of values in terms of conversations?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way I deal with that issue is I kind of agree. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm fully vaccinated, but I totally understand people's feelings about somebody. They don't like people making him do things.
Right.
I don't like people making me do things.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't like, but I will stop at a red light because I'm just hoping like hell the other guy will do the same thing, right? And then we won't kill each other.
Right.
So,
Right.
I mean, so there are ways of having the conversation that, if you can acknowledge something
The
sensible.
nuance about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, well, I think in this conversation, finding common ground partly means acknowledging the truth or the views that somebody might have, and trying to kind of open up that space so that you can have the conversation. And again, that thing that Roger Connor said about the said about the advocacy trap, that people can be dead wrong about something and still be good people. Right.
Absolutely.
And so don't treat them like they're not.
Right. Right. Okay. Let's talk about heart then. So most of the conversations and the disagreements we have inside our own, they're internal. I mean, the amount of conflict probably that humans have between their own two ears as we ruminate on conversations, we project what conversations are going to be like. We're trapped inside our own minds. What is the role of the heart then in solving polarization and in giving us some comfort? And second, what's the role and how do we access that in a practical way in conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think what you're talking about is the positive part of the heart, not the angry part of the heart, right?
Okay.
And when Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk that Suzuki and I met with in Vancouver, after he left Vancouver, this was a number of years back, he went to Chicago and he met with Oprah Winfrey and was interviewed by Oprah. And the question that she asked him was about a book that he'd written called Deep Listening, something about deep listening, compassionate listening. And Oprah just asked him to explain what he was talking about. And it was this beautiful thing that he described. He said, so you go to the person that you're having some conflict with and you talk to them and you say to them, our relationship is important to me, and I feel like I haven't been listening to you.
Well, that would be very surprising. That would probably surprise people and actually make them open in a way.
Yeah. And then if they do, he said, you say, look, I care about you. I care what you're feeling, and I want to understand. And he said that, and so if they accept that and they trust you, that you're telling the truth, and they start to talk, your job is not to correct misinformation, not to react to bitterness, but to let that person empty their heart and say what it is they want to say. And if you have some issue with something they say, leave it for a few days before you talk to them about it.
Right.
And so in that, I think in listening, in that kind of like real genuine listening is the more positive emotions that I think that the Dalai Lama is talking about. And the sort of negative emotions are more when we're not listening. So for me, the title of my book, the reason I chose that title was I'm right and
you're an idiot.
And you're an idiot it was something a guy I interviewed said, and he was horrified that I was going to use it as the title. But and my wife
that website, that URL was still available.
It's such a anyway, it was a really good title because it really got everybody's attention. But I think that it's probably safest to assume that people aren't idiots. And that if you think that you're surrounded by idiots, that probably says more about your own psyche than it says about the people around you.
Oh, that's probably true. I don't like to hear that, but it's probably true. Yeah. So there's a few rapid fire questions that I'd love to just squeeze in beforehand. So do you think that we have a problem with forgiveness in our culture, that we don't let people off the hook when they apologize?
Ooh, yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that's part of this kind of tangle of these negative emotions that the Dalai Lama talked about. That is part of it. It's hard to get out of it. You know, it's like a tangle. And I, you know, I mean, I don't want to present myself as a know-it-all. I mean, I just was lucky enough to speak to these 70 amazing people around the world, but a lot of them talked about this problem with negative emotions and compassion and warm-heartedness and the need for it, you know, practicing it almost. Like it doesn't happen on its own. You know, I interviewed Karen Armstrong, who's like this best-selling author who's written all these books, and she was
yes, she's written some terrific things about compassion and whatnot. She's even got the international, like the Compassion Manifesto, or what's it called? Yeah.
And she had that book. I think it was the Charter for Compassion.
That's what it was.
And she wrote that along with all these spiritual leaders around the world on with the $200,000 that she was given as a TED Prize winner.
Right.
And she said to me that it's all these spiritual leaders, they all sat down, they all agreed that the essence of every religion is a very practical piece of advice. And it is, you know, don't do anything to other people that you wouldn't want people doing to you. And that sort of but that is a practice. And it's something that Confucius talked about and Jesus talked about and Moses talked about in various words, but they basically all said the same thing. And that is, in her mind, not some kind of spiritual thing that you only do on Sundays when you go to church. That was practical advice for people living in a dangerous world.
Right. Oh, well, I think that's absolutely brilliant. Although it is interesting because in one of Jordan Peterson's chapters, he says, you know, humans are actually terrible at taking care of themselves, but we tend to be better at taking care of like things that we love, like our dog. So he said, change it and don't have it that you want people to treat you the way you treat yourself, but have people treat you the way you want to treat your dog. I thought there was something smart about that.
Is good.
We're out of time, but I can't resist this. Anybody that needs to go will go, but if you've got 3 more minutes.
Sure.
So do you think that there are some conversations that are just, you're probably not going to get anywhere? Is it better to focus on the swayable middle and just leave the extreme sides alone? Or do you still think that it's valuable to have every conversation with the same level of intent?
There are, and I know this is the tricky part. I have one of my best friends is a guy named Alex Himmelfarb, who used to be clerk of the Privy Council. And he and I and Miles Richardson, who is a Haida chief, he was the president of the Haida Nation for many, many years. We were having breakfast in Toronto after my book came out. And that both of them looked at me and said, there are evil people there is evil in the world. And I think we can't be naive. There is evil in the world. And so people need to, and there is evil that would love to have you treat it like it was just another opinion. And it's not. And so that's another part of this that makes it incredibly complicated.
It's trying. Well, and how do we as mere mortals make those distinctions, I guess? And there's that very tired phrase, appeasement didn't work with the Nazis. So there is a line there. The two last questions are, so, you know, some people are just struggling for survival. So some of the conversations that we have might appear to be esoteric. I mean, here we are in Canada with the luxury of talking about vaccines or not getting vaccinated, where there's people in the world that would that are literally dying for lack of a vaccine. But there's people that are just struggling just to survive day to day. And so is there, is at some point this is conversation just a luxury, or do you see it as foundational to our survival in the same way that food and air and shelter and all of that is?
I think, to people who've been given so much, there's great responsibility,
Right.
and I think if we tie ourselves up in knots of nonsense, we are less effective. And so I think there's value in these, but I totally understand that question. It is a luxury that we have this conversation, but we need to get better at this because, we are among the people who can do something about these problems. There's a lot of people in the world, as much as they'd like to, who can't.
I agree. And last question then, could you just tell us what are the practices then that you have either in general, or do you have something that you do right before you go into a difficult conversation, a mantra or a state of mind or something that you do to actually prepare yourself for difficult conversations?
I love Zen Buddhist meditation. And so, and I practice other types of meditation as well. But so I meditate and I exercise, and those help me. Meditation, especially the type of meditation there's a book called The Beginner's Mind. And it's like a sort of the Bible of Soto Zen meditation, that you just have to read it and you can just do it. Right. And so those types of meditation, I think, are more likely to help you kind of get out of that, conflict riddled part of your mind.
Right. Well, I'm laughing because the type of meditation that I started with was silent meditation. And so I guess if you're practicing silent meditation, you're definitely avoiding conflict with other people. So I'll leave it with that as a great recommendation. If we're all just silent, then all of this level of conflict will surely disappear. But anyway, thank you so much. I so appreciate your time. I highly recommend your book. I'll make sure that we put a link to it on all of our sites. But even beyond that, what I really appreciate is your ongoing dedication to this, to recognize that civil discourse really is a foundation for all of the other problems that we are facing in the world, and that's a real contribution, not just to, I know what your issue that you're focused on mainly with the environment, but into all of the other issues. So thank you very much, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, we'll follow up. As I said, there'll be a sequel. I still have more questions.
Okay.